Hello, and welcome to this video on if and how Buffy the Vampire Slayer could work. Buffy is the lead character from the series Buffy the Vampire Slayer of Joss Whedon's creation, and played by Sarah Michelle Gellar. Buffy is the most recent young woman to assume the title of Slayer. A Slayer is the current representation of a long line of young women chosen to battle evil. This endows her with powers that increase physical strength, endurance, agility, accelerated healing, intuition, and a degree of prophecy. Despite these exceptional characteristics, the Slayer still resembles a relatively normal female, albeit an attractive one. There is no extra muscle size or mass, the character consumes a reduced amount of food, and is limited to the socially acceptable activities of a teenager, largely. In order to achieve this, let's look at what is required for each of these characteristics. The simple fact being that no matter how and what the cause of the Slayer's power is, it must be grounded in some kind of fundamental, scientifically valid mechanism, such as genetics and physiology. This would explain the Slayer's random occurrence, if it is caused by random mutations to create the sum result. Let's begin by looking at the skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is the primary means of exerting force and the source of strength. It is necessary for the Slayer to adapt the skeletal muscle mechanisms in order to exert the strength they are characterized. But how? The Slayer requires several adaptations considering the physical appearance. The first is a greater condensing of muscle fibers, or a greater capacity for contraction. The first is seen in several of the ape species, who are unable to swim due to the density. The alternative is muscle fibers must have greater contractibility. Either option increases the ability or the amount of muscle that responds to stimulus, and thereby increases the strength. This would be done via type 1 fibers, which preferentially express enzymes that oxidize fatty acids and contain slow forms of contractile proteins. These are more resistant to fatigue. Then there are type 2 fibers, which preferentially metabolize glucose, and these express fast forms of contractile proteins. Endurance exercise training triggers a remodeling of these in skeletal muscles, and that progressively enhances performance, particularly in marathon runners, mountain climbers, and cyclists. This involves changes in metabolic programs and proteins within the fiber that makes up muscles. This alters the energy substrate utilization and contractile properties, and these reduce both muscle fatigue and increase the ability of the muscle to act. Training-based adaptations in the muscle are linked to increases in the expression of genes involved in slow contractile mechanisms of the muscle, mitochondria, and fatty acid oxidation. More than that, skeletal muscles rich in slow fibers are resistant to muscle wasting, which would make sense as Buffy is not shown to engage in any especially rigorous forms of training. Bone mass can be explained by sclerosis, a rare autosomal recessive high bone mass genetic disease that is characterized by progressive bone thickening and hardening. These two particular factors, muscles and bones, would alter the energy, nutrient, and food requirements of the Slayer. The Slayer, as portrayed in Buffy, has an inadequate calorie, nutrient, and mineral intake for this particular scenario. The amount of protein and minerals for bone and muscle development and maintenance is insufficient. A healthy, active 16 to 17-year-old female requires 2,400 calories, and the Slayer should be considerably higher given their increased physical activity and physical requirements. Roughly 30% of the energy in an average 16 to 17-year-old female should be in the form of protein-rich sources. Next is the endurance characteristic. Overexpression of the active PPR delta gene in skeletal muscle of mice programs an increase in oxidative muscle fibers, which enhances running endurance by nearly 100%. If the Slayer had this particular mutation, their increased performance and physical attributes would make sense. It was found that the PPAR delta agonist enables mice to run 60 to 75% longer and further than non-control mice, and when combined with exercise training, it increases this further. A critical role of the AMPK gene in the superendurance of these mice is revealed in other experiments, and it was found that active AMPK agonists are sufficient as a single agent to improve the running of an athlete in this scenario, and that improvement was by nearly 45%. Singularly or in combination, these mutations would result in the Slayer's improved physical endurance. Endurance training involved chronically increased contractile activity of muscles, and the multitude of adaptations that occur while training allow for greater performance, but these also increase the number of capillaries and increase the density of mitochondria in muscle fibers. These also increase enzymes such as the 3-hydroxylacyl-CoA dehydrogenase and citrate synthase. These being elevated increase the contraction of transport proteins, improve glycogen concentration, and a relative increase in the occurrence of the type 2A fibers. This comes at the expense of type 2X fibers, but this increases the ability to metabolize fat and means that the non-oxidative action and energy use would be improved. But this brings us back to the original question of how does the Slayer support this? The Slayer would need to have not only these mutations, but an exceptionally high red blood cell count to accommodate the increased physical activity and consequential demand for resources, as well as requiring a much higher food intake than is shown in the show. The next attribute to be discussed is agility. Rapid agility requires fine muscle control and regulation during muscle contraction. Mostly, lower extremities are known to be caused by the balance of flexors and extensors. This causes latent responses of genetic factors following training, and it leads to changes in the body and development at the molecular level of these changes. ACTN3 is a gene associated with improved agility. ACTN3 is highly related to physical fitness, both aerobic and anaerobic, and contributes to the structure and function of the muscles. It is uniquely and restrictively expressed within the fast-twitch fibers, and is related to muscular strength and agility in athletes. Combat sports athletes, such as Buffy, are expected to have a higher incidence of change within their agility, and they may have a higher injury risk according to the ratio of imbalance during decelerating movements. This is compared to both sprinters and endurance sports athletes. This is where the next point comes in. Accelerated healing is another attribute, and it has relevance to many of the previously mentioned skill sets or attributes. Extensive burns and full-thickness skin wounds can be devastating, and they are often seen on the show. Wounds injected with human CD34 positive or CD34 negative peripheral blood nucleus cells were analyzed for vascularity and healing at various times in experiments. Treatment with CD34 positive cells increased wound size treatment and healing by 4 days. The accelerated epidermal healing rapidly and dramatically accelerated vascularization of the wounds, and this was compared to controls. Added to that, diminished production of vascular endothelial growth factor and decreased angiogenesis are thought to contribute to impaired tissue repair. The epithelial growth factors demonstrated increased epithelialization, increased matrix deposition, and enhanced cellular proliferation. This effectively translates to a faster healing time in experiments done with the vascular growth factors. Experiments demonstrated an increased rate of repair of phosphate buffered saline treated wounds compared to others, and this was 18 days versus 25, a nearly 30% improvement over the control group. Topical vascular epithelial growth factor improves wound healing by locally upregulating growth factors important for tissue repair. This mobilizes bone marrow cells. These contribute to blood vessel formation and recruiting cells to the local wound, where they are able to accelerate repair. Estrogen accelerates healing as well, and this may be why the Slayer is nearly always female. A shift occurs in the balance between serum estrogen and androgen levels in the normal feature of human aging, and that may be why it is difficult for older people to heal minor wounds. However, the Slayer is nearly always young, and nearly always dies young in the course of their duties. And this may be owing to the lack of healing, and the rate at which it reduces over time and age. The combat ability and other intuition might be considered a form of savantism. If the Slayer is a savant, it would account for the scarcity of candidates, as there are 5 males for every female savant. Savants display a narrow repertoire of skills which tend to be highly structured, rule-based, and non-verbal. Savant syndrome can be congenital or acquired. When congenital, the skill appears early in childhood, and when acquired, abilities appear to spring forth suddenly following stroke, brain injury, or dementia. Savant skills that occur most frequently are present where right hemisphere skills and deficits were most strongly associated, and left hemisphere functions are decreased. It is found in mice that lacking a certain brain protein, some tasks are learnt better, but they're also forgotten faster, and that this new research from MIT may explain how there is savantism. The final described attribute is prophecy, and this is an interesting one. Sensory processing sensitivity is proposed as an innate trait associated with greater sensitivity to environmental and social stimulus. It's becoming increasingly associated with identifiable genes, behavior, physical reactions, and patterns of brain activation. Sensitivity processing is thought to be one of two strategies evolved for promoting survival of the species, and by being more responsive to the environment, the organism has an enhanced awareness of opportunities, food, mates, alliances, and, in this case, danger. This survival strategy is effective as long as the benefits of increased sensitivity outweigh costs, and these costs are an increased demand on energy and brain resources. It is still metabolically costly, so selective attention may be the other way to go about it, and that is where prophetic dreams may come into play. Across most of the conditions, they have found that the sensitivity scores were positively associated with activity of parts of the brain. These parts of the brain are the lower animal type parts of the brain, the lizard brain. These are also associated with the unconscious. In the show, the Slayer is described as receiving the prophetic dreams unconsciously, and that may be how these come about. They are derived from the human brain, acquired in three components that progressively appeared throughout evolution, and they are superimposed over each other. The oldest is located to the bottom and to the back, the next is on top and in an intermediate position, and the most recent part of the brain that has been developed is on top and to the front. They are respectively the primitive brain or reptilian brain, the intermediate or old mammalian brain, and then the neopallium, which is also known as the superior or rational brain and also called the new mammalian brain. This comprises almost the whole of the hemispheres. This is the conscious part of the brain. The first two sections are not conscious. There is a little almond-shaped structure deep inside the inferior region of the temporal lobes, and these connect to the hippocampus. These in turn play an important role in the mediation and control of major emotional activities like friendship, love, and affection. Telepathy has been associated with an activation of these areas, whereas control of subject without telepathic abilities have been activated in the left of these sections. These particular attributes may explain to a certain extent why Buffy is said to have prophetic ability. However, it would require considerable mutation in those brain structures and an increase in their physical capacity and capability, and the fact the mutation did not cause substantial deficits to the overall function of the rest of the brain. They would also be associated with an increased demand for glucose, as the neurons feed almost exclusively on these particular forms of sugar and energy. There is a final unstated possibility as to an attribute that is not immediately apparent, and that would be the genetics of the Slayer. One gene in particular, the monoamine oxidase A, also known as the MAOA, or warrior gene, which is an enzyme that in humans encodes for a particular set of genes. This gene is one of two, and they encode for mitochondrial enzymes. These catalyze the deamination of amines like dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. They've also been associated with a variety of psychiatric disorders, including antisocial behavior. In some variants, the allele associated with behavioral traits is shorter, and as a result it produces less MAOA enzyme. When faced with social exclusion or ostracism, individuals with a low activity MAOA showed high levels of aggression than individuals with the high activity MAOA gene. Low activity MAOA could significantly predict aggressive behavior, but is less associated with aggression in low provocation situations. Individuals with low activity variants of the MAOA gene were just as likely as participants with high MAOA to react aggressively to both low and high provocation situations. If there was a mutation in the gene that is involved in the process of promoting or inhibiting MAOA, it could affect the Slayer's personality or behavior, and therefore make them more prone, or in this case, capable of engaging in aggressive activity. That would explain the selectivity of the Slayer. The MAOA mutation, in association with both brain and physiological changes, would be a very unique person, considering the probability of any one of these mutations being deleterious to health and life. Looking at these particular attributes, it's clearly possible that the Slayer can occur at a genetic level. The phenotypes corresponding to physical changes are possible. However, the behaviors of the character are not consistent with the demands put on the body by these mutations and changes, and as a consequence, although theoretically possible, the character as shown in the show would unlikely be able to cope with their particular diet and lifestyle for an extended period of time without considerably increased support than they are shown to have. Without considerably better social and personal support, the Slayer would likely continue to deteriorate in a physical state until they cease to be functional. This may also play into the short lifespan of most Slayers, as claimed in the show. Thank you for watching, and please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you may have below.